Story 1. Vanishing of Eklutna Annie. I should have never taken that job with the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit. Some mysteries are meant to stay buried in the frozen ground, left to the wolves and the endless winter nights. But I was young, ambitious, and I thought I could solve anything. I thought the dead wanted justice. I was wrong about that last part. My name is Detective Sarah Chen, and for 37 years, I carried a case file that slowly consumed my life. A case about a woman we called Eklutna Annie, found dead along the Glen Highway in 1980. Her identity as mysterious as the circumstances that brought her to that lonely stretch of Alaskan wilderness. What I discovered during my investigation changed everything I believed about life, death, and the thin places where the two intersect. The first time I saw her photograph, I knew she was different. Not the crime scene photos. Those were too brutal, too clinical. I mean, the reconstruction they made of her face, based on her skull measurements and forensic artistry. She had kind eyes, the artist said, gentle features that spoke of someone who smiled often. Someone who trusted easily. Someone who never saw death coming until it was too late. She was found by hunters in September 1980. Her remains scattered across a gravel pit near Eklutna, about 20 miles north of Anchorage. The animals had been at her for months, maybe longer. What was left told a story of violence that made even seasoned investigators sick to their stomachs. She had been strangled, probably tortured, definitely murdered. But that was all we knew for certain. No identification. No missing person report that matched. No fingerprints in any database. It was like she had simply materialized in that gravel pit, fully formed and ready to die. The only clues were her clothes, cheap and worn, the kind you buy at discount stores when money is tight. And a single earring, made of turquoise and silver, with a distinctive Native American design that would become my obsession for the next 4 decades. I joined the investigation in 1987, fresh out of the academy and assigned to the cold case division because nobody else wanted to deal with the growing pile of unsolved murders that seemed to multiply in Alaska like mosquitoes in summer. The state was a magnet for drifters, runaways, and people trying to disappear. Perfect hunting ground for predators who knew how to use the vast wilderness to hide their crimes. My first supervisor, Lieutenant Marcus Reeves, handed me the file with a warning I should have heeded. He had worked the case from the beginning, spent 7 years chasing leads that led nowhere, interviewing witnesses who remembered nothing useful, following tips that always ended in dead ends and frozen earth. "This one will get under your skin," he told me, his weathered face serious in the fluorescent light of the bullpen. "There's something about her that hooks you. Maybe it's because she looks so normal, so innocent. Maybe it's because we have absolutely nothing to go on. But I've seen good cops lose themselves in this case. Don, did it happen to you?" I nodded and took the file, confident in my abilities, certain I could find the answers that had eluded everyone else. I was 25 years old and believed justice was just a matter of asking the right questions to the right people. I had no idea I was about to spend the rest of my career asking questions that had no answers, chasing shadows that grew longer and darker with each passing year. The breakthrough came in 1991, 11 years after Annie's death. A serial killer named Robert Hansen was arrested for the murders of multiple women in the Anchorage area. Hansen was a local baker who had been abducting women, flying them out to remote locations in his private plane, then hunting them like animals in the wilderness. When detectives searched his property, they found a collection of jewelry that had belonged to his victims. Among those items was a turquoise and silver earring, identical to the one found with Eklutna Annie. I remember the moment I saw that earring in the evidence room, how my hands shook as I compared it to the photographs from Annie's crime scene. Perfect match, same craftsmanship, same distinctive spiral pattern, same small chip on the silver setting. We had found our killer, but Hansen denied knowing Annie. Even after confessing to the murders of 17 other women, even after leading us to their burial sites, even after pleading guilty to avoid the death penalty, he insisted he had never seen the woman we called Eklutna Annie. He claimed the earring must have been a coincidence, that he had never encountered anyone matching her description. His denial felt genuine, and that bothered me more than I cared to admit. Hansen was a meticulous record keeper who remembered details about all his victims, kept trophies, marked their locations on aviation maps with small X marks like some twisted treasure map. But when shown Annie's reconstruction, he showed no recognition, no pride in his work. No satisfaction at being connected to another kill. It's not mine, he told me during one of our interviews, his pale eyes studying the photograph with professional interest. I would remember her. I remember them all. That should have been the end of it. Case closed, killer identified, mystery solved. But something nagged at me, a feeling I could not shake that we were missing something important, something that would change everything if we could just see it clearly. I began my own investigation into the earring, tracing its origins through jewelry stores and Native American craft shops across Alaska and the lower 48. The design was Navajo, made by a silversmith in New Mexico who sold his work to tourist shops throughout the Southwest. The earrings were part of a limited run he had made in 1978. Only 50 pairs total, sold to various retailers between Albuquerque and Flagstaff. This led me to Annie, its most likely origin point, somewhere in the American Southwest, probably Arizona or New Mexico, probably sometime in late 1979 or early 1980. She had traveled over 2,000 miles to die in an Alaskan gravel pit, and I needed to know why. I spent my vacations driving through desert towns, showing Annie its reconstruction to motel clerks, waitresses, gas station attendants, anyone who might have seen her. I walked through truck stops and diners, posted flyers on bulletin boards, talked to local police departments about missing persons from that time period. Always the same response. Sorry, Don, to recognize her. Wish we could help. But in Gallup, New Mexico, I finally found someone who remembered. Her name was Rosa Montoya, and she managed a small diner just off Interstate 40, the kind of place where truckers stop for coffee and pie and conversation with anyone willing to listen. Rosa had been working there since 1975, and she had an extraordinary memory for faces, especially the faces of young women traveling alone who looked like they needed help. I remember her, Rosa said when I showed her the reconstruction, her weathered hands tracing the outline of Annie's face. She came in here 3, maybe 4 times in the winter of 1980. Always alone, always ordered the same thing, coffee and apple pie. Always paid in exact change like money was tight. Rosa described a young woman in her early 20s, quiet and polite, with long brown hair and sad eyes that never quite met yours when she talked. She spoke with a slight accent that Rosa could not place, maybe Canadian, maybe from somewhere in the northern Midwest. She always sat in the corner booth, facing the door, like she was watching for someone who never came. The last time I saw her, she was talking to this man, Rosa continued, her voice dropping to a whisper as if the walls might be listening. Older guy, maybe 40, 45. Well-dressed, expensive boots, drove a nice truck with Alaska plates. They talked for a long time, and when they left together. Rosa's description matched dozens of men who frequented that stretch of highway, truck drivers and construction workers and oil field employees who traveled between the Southwest and Alaska following work opportunities. But there was something specific she remembered about this particular man, something that had bothered her enough that she mentioned it to the local police at the time. He had these eyes, she said, shuddering slightly despite the desert heat. Cold eyes, like a snake or something. And when he smiled, it never reached those eyes. Made my skin crawl just watching him. The local police had no record of Rosa's report, no missing person case for anyone matching Annie's description, no follow-up investigation. Just another young woman who disappeared into the vast American landscape, one more face that would never be seen again by anyone who cared enough to look for her. But Rosa had done something the police hadn't. She had written down the license plate number of the man's truck, tucked the scrap of paper into her wallet, and kept it there for 11 years just in case someone like me ever came asking questions. The license plate traced back to a man named David Mitchell, a construction foreman who had worked on the Alaska Pipeline project in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Mitchell had a clean record. No arrests, no complaints, nothing that would raise red flags during a routine background check. He owned a small construction company in Fairbanks, was married with 2 teenage children, coached Little League baseball, attended church every Sunday. The perfect neighbor. The kind of man you would trust with your spare key, who would shovel your driveway after a snowstorm without being asked, who would never hurt anyone. But when I dug deeper into Mitchell's background, patterns began to emerge that made my blood run cold. He had traveled frequently between Alaska and the lower 48 during the pipeline construction years. Always alone, always for extended periods. His work record showed gaps of several weeks at a time with no clear explanation for his whereabouts. And most troubling of all, his travel patterns coincided with the disappearances of at least 6 other young women across 4 states. I presented my findings to the district attorney, expecting to finally get the resources for a full investigation. Instead, I was told to drop the case. Mitchell had powerful friends, political connections, and an expensive lawyer who threatened to sue the state for harassment if we continued what he called a fishing expedition based on coincidence and speculation. The official word came down from the Attorney General's office. Eklutna Annie. This murder was solved. Robert Hansen was the killer. Case closed. Any further investigation would be considered insubordination and could result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. I should have listened. I should have put the file back in storage and moved on to other cases, other mysteries, other chances for justice. But I could not stop thinking about Annie's face, about Rosa's description of those cold eyes, about the 6 other women who had vanished along Mitchell's route like breadcrumbs in a dark forest. So I continued my investigation on my own time, using my own resources, following leads that officially did not exist. I traced Mitchell's movements through truck stop receipts and motel registrations, credit card purchases, and employment records. I contacted police departments in small towns across the West, asking about unsolved disappearances and unidentified remains, always careful not to mention Mitchell's name or my official capacity. The pattern that emerged was terrifying in its consistency. Every 18 to 24 months, Mitchell would take an extended trip between Alaska and the Southwest. Every trip coincided with the disappearance of a young woman traveling alone, usually a runaway or drifter whose absence would not be immediately noticed. The women were always found months or years later in remote locations, always strangled, always missing pieces of jewelry or clothing that were never recovered. But it was not until 1998 that I found the proof I needed to connect Mitchell to Eklutna Annie's murder. A hiker in Denali National Park discovered the remains of a woman who had been missing since 1983. Along with her bones, he found a small cache of personal items that had been carefully buried nearby. Jewelry, photographs, pieces of clothing that had belonged to the victim and others. Among those items was a turquoise and silver earring, identical to the ones Hansen had claimed and the one found with Annie. But this earring had something the others did not. A small engraving on the back, invisible unless you knew to look for it. Letters scratched into the silver with something sharp. DM David Mitchell, his initials. I took the earring to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, where microscopic analysis confirmed what I already knew. The engraving had been made with the same tool that had created similar marks on jewelry found at other crime scenes across 4 states. Mitchell was not just a killer, he was a collector, someone who kept trophies of his victims and marked them like a rancher brands cattle. But when I returned to Alaska with this evidence, I discovered that David Mitchell had died 3 months earlier. Heart attack while working on a construction site outside Fairbanks. He was 58 years old, survived by his wife and children, remembered by his community as a generous man who helped his neighbors and donated time and money to local charities. His death should have brought closure to the case, but instead it raised new questions that haunted me for the next 25 years. If Mitchell was dead, who had been sending me anonymous letters about the case? Who had been calling my unlisted home phone number at 3 in the morning, breathing into the receiver before hanging up? Who had been leaving turquoise and silver earrings on my doorstep every year on the anniversary of Annie's discovery? The letters started arriving in 1999, 1 year after Mitchell's death. Plain white envelopes with no return address, postmarked from different cities across Alaska. Inside each envelope was a single photograph. Crime scenes I had never seen before. Women I could not identify. Bodies arranged in poses that were disturbingly similar to how Annie had been found. The photographs were professional quality, taken with expensive equipment, developed in a darkroom with the kind of precision that suggested technical expertise. But more unsettling was what they revealed. Mitchell had not been working alone. Someone else had been present at these crime scenes, someone with the knowledge and opportunity to document Mitchell's work, someone who was still alive and still active. I tried to trace the letters through postal inspectors, handwriting analysts, forensic photographers, anyone who might be able to identify their source. But the person sending them was careful, methodical, always one step ahead of any investigation. The postmarks came from different post offices. The paper was the kind you could buy at any office supply store. The photographs were printed on equipment that could be found in any commercial photo lab. The phone calls were worse than the letters. Always at night. Always when I was alone. Always from different numbers that trace back to payphones or prepaid cell phones. The caller never spoke, just breathed into the phone for 30 or 40 seconds before hanging up. But there was something deliberate about those calls. Something that suggested the person knew my schedule. Knew when I would be home. Knew how to maximize the psychological impact of their harassment. I changed my phone number 6 times in 10 years. It never mattered. Somehow, they always found the new number. Always resumed their campaign of anonymous terror. The earrings were the worst part, though. Every September 15th, the anniversary of Annie's discovery, I would find a turquoise and silver earring on my doorstep. Always the same design. Always identical to the one found at her crime scene. Always placed precisely in the center of my welcome mat like an offering to some dark god. I installed security cameras, motion sensors, alarm systems that would wake the dead. Nothing captured the person who left these tokens. They came and went like smoke, invisible to electronic eyes, leaving no footprints in the snow or mud. No trace of their presence except for those cursed earrings that accumulated in my evidence box like radioactive waste. By 2010, I had collected 11 earrings, taken dozens of photographs I could not identify, and received over 100 anonymous letters about crimes that had never been officially reported. My supervisors thought I was losing my mind. My colleagues avoided me at work. My family stopped inviting me to holiday gatherings because I could not stop talking about the case that had consumed my life. I retired in 2015, officially due to health reasons, actually because I could no longer function as a police officer. The mystery of Eklutna Annie had broken something fundamental inside me, shattered my faith in justice and truth and the basic human decency that I had built my career upon. I moved to a small cabin outside Palmer, Alaska, surrounded myself with case files and evidence boxes, and dedicated my remaining years to solving the unsolvable. That was when I found the journal. It was hidden in the wall of my cabin, tucked behind the insulation in a space so small and carefully concealed that I only discovered it by accident while repairing damage from a burst pipe. The journal was wrapped in plastic, perfectly preserved despite being hidden for decades, filled with handwritten entries that dated back to 1978. The handwriting belonged to David Mitchell. The journal revealed everything: how Mitchell had met and recruited partners in different cities, how they had identified and selected their victims, how they had developed their techniques for abduction and murder and disposal. But more than that, it revealed Mitchell's growing paranoia in his final years, his certainty that someone was watching him, following him, documenting his activities. "They know about Annie," he wrote in one of his final entries, dated just weeks before his death. "They have photographs, evidence, things that could destroy everything I have built. But they do not want justice. They want to continue the work. They want to become what I created." The journal's final entry was a confession and a warning. Mitchell had been training a successor, someone younger and more careful, someone who would continue his work after his death but in a more sophisticated way. This successor had been watching me from the beginning, using my investigation to learn how law enforcement operated, how to avoid detection, how to select victims who would not be missed or mourned. "Detective Chen is perfect," Mitchell wrote. "Dedicated, obsessive, isolated from her colleagues and family. She will spend years chasing shadows while the real work continues. And when she finally understands what she has been part of, it will be too late to stop what we have set in motion." The journal ended there, but paper clipped to the final page was a photograph I had never seen before. It showed me at my desk in the police station, taken with a telephoto lens through the window, my face clearly visible as I studied crime scene photographs. Written on the back in Mitchell's handwriting were the words, "Next project begins when current subject retires." That was 3 years ago. Since then, the letters and phone calls have stopped. No more anonymous photographs. No more midnight breathing into my telephone. No more turquoise earrings on my doorstep. The silence is more terrifying than the harassment ever was, because I know what it means. I was never investigating Eklutna Annie, this murder. I was being investigated. For 37 years, I thought I was hunting a killer, when actually a killer was studying me, learning my methods, my weaknesses, my obsessions, using my dedication against me, turning my pursuit of justice into a training exercise for the next generation of predators. The woman we called Eklutna Annie was not David Mitchell, his victim. She was his first recruit, someone he trained and tested before sending her north to begin her own hunting. The turquoise earring was not a trophy. It was a signal, a way for like-minded individuals to identify each other across the vast American landscape. And now that I am retired, isolated, and completely consumed by this case, I have become the perfect candidate for recruitment myself. The letters and phone calls were not harassment. They were conditioning, slowly breaking down my connection to normal human society, making me dependent on the very mystery that had destroyed my life. I understand now why Rosa remembered Annie so clearly, why her description was so detailed and specific. Rosa was part of the network, another scout identifying potential victims and routing them toward their fate. The man with the cold eyes and Alaska plates was not David Mitchell. He was Mitchell, his predecessor, the one who trained Mitchell the same way Mitchell trained Annie. The same way Annie, his successors, trained whoever has been watching me for all these years. There is a knock at my cabin door as I write this, soft and patient and persistent. Through the window, I can see the outline of a woman, young and slender, with long dark hair that reminds me of the reconstruction we made of Annie, his face all those years ago. She is holding something in her hand, something that catches the moonlight like silver and turquoise. She knows I will answer the door. After 37 years of conditioning, I have no choice. I am too curious, too obsessed, too completely broken by this case to turn away from what might finally be answers to questions that have consumed my entire adult life. The knocking continues, gentle but insistent, and I find myself walking toward the door despite every instinct screaming at me to run. Because this is what they have been preparing me for, what Mitchell's journal predicted, what my entire career has been leading toward. I am about to become Eklutna Annie. Story 2. Alaska Triangle. I never believed in the Alaska Triangle until I became part of it. The morning Congressman Hale Boggs vanished from the sky between Anchorage and Juneau. I was flying search and rescue missions over some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. What I found up there changed everything I thought I knew about reality, physics, and the thin line between the living and the disappeared. My name is Captain Jake Morrison, and I spent 23 years flying helicopters for the Alaska Air National Guard. I participated in the largest search operation in American history, looking for a missing aircraft that carried 4 men into the heart of the Alaska Triangle and never came back. But the real horror was not what we failed to find. It was what found us instead. October 16, 1972. The weather was typical for Alaska in the fall. Low clouds, shifting winds, visibility that changed every few minutes from crystal clear to absolutely zero. Congressman Hale Boggs was flying from Anchorage to Juneau in a twin-engine Cessna 310 with House Majority Leader Nick Begich, pilot Don Johns, and an aide named Russell Brown. Routine flight, experienced pilot, aircraft in perfect condition. The kind of trip that happens hundreds of times every year without incident. They took off at 9 a.m. and were expected in Juneau by 11:30. By noon, when they had not arrived and were not responding to radio calls, we knew something was wrong. By 2 p.m., we had launched the first search aircraft. By nightfall, we had 40 planes and helicopters combing every mile of their planned flight path. We found nothing. No wreckage, no emergency signals, no trace that they had ever existed except for a few scattered reports from other pilots who claimed to have seen a small plane flying erratically through the mountain passes around the time Boggs disappeared. But those reports made no sense. The witnesses described impossible flight patterns, aircraft that seemed to hover in midair despite having no helicopter capabilities, planes that appeared to fly backwards through mountain valleys, wings that rotated and shifted like they were made of liquid metal instead of aluminum and steel. I dismissed these accounts as pilot error, optical illusions caused by low visibility and difficult flying conditions. Mountains play tricks on your eyes, especially when you are flying through clouds and trying to navigate by instruments alone. The human brain sees what it expects to see, fills in the gaps with familiar patterns even when reality is telling a different story. That was before I saw them myself. 3 days into the search, I was flying by A1 Huey through Portage Pass, following the same route Boggs would have taken if he had been trying to avoid the worst of the weather. The clouds were thick that morning, hanging like gray wool between the mountain peaks, reducing visibility to maybe 200 yards in any direction. I was flying slow and low, scanning the tree line for any sign of wreckage or survivors, when I spotted movement in the valley below. At first I thought it was wildlife, maybe a moose or bear crossing the tundra. But as I descended for a closer look, I realized I was seeing something that should not exist. There were people down there, dozens of them, maybe more, walking in single file across the barren landscape like some kind of funeral procession. They were dressed in modern clothing, business suits and casual wear that looked completely out of place in the Alaskan wilderness. They moved with purpose but without urgency, following some invisible path that led from nowhere to nowhere. I keyed my radio to report the sighting to search headquarters, but all I got was static. The interference was so thick it sounded like voices whispering in languages I could not understand. I tried switching to emergency frequencies, backup channels, anything that might punch through whatever was jamming my communications. Nothing worked, so I decided to land and investigate on my own, setting the Huey down on a small clearing about half a mile from where I had seen the procession. The moment my skids touched the ground, the silence hit me like a physical blow. No wind, no wildlife sounds, no background noise of any kind. Just absolute quiet that made my ears ring and my skin crawl. I shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit, checking my sidearm and survival gear before heading toward where I had seen the people walking. The ground beneath my boots was spongy and strange, like walking on foam rubber that had been painted to look like tundra. Every step seemed to echo despite the complete lack of any surface that should produce an echo. But when I reached the spot where the procession should have been, I found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had passed through the area in years or decades. The landscape was pristine, untouched, as if I had imagined the entire sighting. Except for the airplane. It was sitting in a small depression about 50 yards from where I stood, a twin-engine Cessna 310 that looked like it had been placed there by hand rather than crashed. No skid marks, no broken trees, no gouges in the earth to suggest a hard landing. The aircraft was intact and upright, its registration numbers clearly visible on the wings and fuselage. N1812H. Congressman Boggs. Missing plane. I approached the aircraft carefully, my hand resting on my pistol grip, every instinct screaming that something was wrong with this discovery. The plane looked too clean, too undamaged for something that had been missing for 3 days in some of the harshest terrain in North America. The paint was fresh, the windows were clear, the propellers showed no signs of impact damage. But it was empty. All 4 seats were vacant, seatbelts still fastened as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-flight. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the cabin. Briefcases, coffee cups, newspapers dated October 16, 1972. Everything you would expect to find in a plane that had disappeared 3 days earlier. Everything except the people. I keyed my radio again, desperate to report the discovery, but the static had gotten worse. Now it sounded like multiple conversations happening simultaneously, overlapping voices that seemed to be discussing the weather, flight plans, navigational problems. Routine aviation chatter, except that some of the voices were talking about aircraft types that had not been manufactured yet, referring to navigation equipment that would not be invented for another decade. That was when I noticed the logbook. It was sitting open on the pilot's seat, filled with entries in handwriting I did not recognize. But the dates were all wrong. The logbook showed flights extending years into the future, routes between cities that did not exist, passenger manifests that included names I had never heard before. According to the entries, N1812H had been making regular flights between Anchorage and Juneau every day since its disappearance, carrying different passengers on each trip but always following the same road through the mountain passes. The logbook showed hundreds of flights, thousands of passengers, decades of service for an aircraft that had been missing for less than a week. But the final entry was different from the others. Instead of routine flight information, someone had written a single sentence in block letters that made my blood freeze. Captain Morrison arrives today. My name, written in a logbook that should not exist, in an airplane that had been missing for 3 days, by someone who knew I was coming before I knew it myself. I backed away from the aircraft, every nerve in my body screaming danger, when I heard the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was the distant whine of aircraft engines, multiple planes flying in formation somewhere above the cloud cover. But these were not search aircraft. The engine sounds were wrong, too high-pitched and mechanical, like turbines mixed with something organic that pulsed and breathed. The sounds grew louder as whatever was making them descended through the clouds. I ran back toward my helicopter, abandoning any pretense of military bearing or search protocol. Survival instinct had taken over, primal fear that told me to get airborne immediately and put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was coming down from the sky. But my Huey would not start. The engine turned over normally, all systems showed green, but something fundamental was missing. It was like trying to start a car with no gasoline, except my fuel gauges read full and my batteries were charged. The helicopter had simply lost the ability to create lift, as if the laws of physics had been suspended in this particular valley. The engine sounds above me had resolved into individual aircraft now, at least a dozen planes circling through the cloud cover like vultures waiting for something to die. I could see their shadows moving across the overcast sky, dark shapes that were too large and moved in patterns that defied aerodynamics. Then the first one broke through the clouds. It was N1812H, the same Cessna 310 that was sitting empty 50 yards away from me, except this one was flying. Same registration numbers, same paint scheme, same everything except for the people inside. Through the cabin windows I could see 4 figures in the passenger seats, their faces pressed against the glass, looking down at me with expressions of desperate pleading. Congressman Boggs was in the front passenger seat. I recognized him from newspaper photographs, his distinctive features unmistakable even from my position on the ground. He was mouthing words I could not hear, gesturing frantically at something behind me, trying to warn me about some danger I could not see. But it was not just one aircraft. As more planes descended through the clouds, I realized I was looking at dozens of identical Cessnas, all bearing the same registration number, all carrying the same 4 passengers, all trapped in some kind of eternal flight pattern that kept them circling through the Alaska Triangle like ghosts in a mechanical purgatory. The passengers in every plane were trying to communicate with me, pressing notes against the windows, making hand signals, screaming silently through soundproof glass. But their messages were all the same. Warnings about something behind me, urgent gestures telling me to turn around and look at what was approaching from the direction of my disabled helicopter. I turned around and saw myself. Another Jake Morrison was walking across the tundra toward my position, dressed in the same flight suit, carrying the same survival gear, wearing the same expression of confused terror that I could feel on my own face. He was maybe 30 yards away, close enough that I could see individual details. The scar on his left hand from a childhood accident, the slight limp from a helicopter crash in Vietnam, the way his right eye twitched when he was afraid. He was me, but he was also not me. There was something wrong with his movements, too fluid and precise, like someone performing a careful imitation of human behavior. His eyes never blinked, his breathing never changed, and when he opened his mouth to speak, no sound came out even though his lips moved in perfect synchronization with words I could not hear. Behind him, more figures were emerging from the landscape. Other search pilots, ground crew members, coordinators from the rescue operation, all walking in the same eerily precise manner, all wearing the same expression of artificial calm. They looked like people I recognized, colleagues and friends from the airbase, but none of them cast shadows and their feet made no sound on the spongy ground. I realized that everyone who had participated in the search for Congressman Boggs had ended up here, in this place that existed somewhere between the living world and whatever lay beyond. We had all been drawn into the Alaska Triangle, one by one, until we became part of the mystery we were trying to solve. The circling aircraft above me began to descend. Dozens of identical planes carrying hundreds of identical passengers, all trapped in the same loop of time and space that had claimed everyone who came looking for answers. I understood now why the search operation had been the largest in American history. Not because of the importance of the missing congressman, but because the triangle had been feeding, growing stronger with every rescue worker who entered its boundaries. My duplicate reached me and extended his hand, palm up, revealing a small object that glinted in the filtered sunlight. It was a piece of metal, twisted and blackened, clearly from an aircraft crash. But stamped into its surface were coordinates, latitude and longitude numbers that meant nothing to me until I realized what they represented. They were the exact position where I was standing. The metal fragment was from my own helicopter, from a crash that had not happened yet but would happen soon, adding one more aircraft to the collection of disappeared vehicles that populated the Alaska Triangle. I was looking at evidence of my own future demise, handed to me by a version of myself that had already experienced that fate. Above me, the circle of identical Cessnas began to tighten, their passengers becoming more frantic in their attempts to communicate warnings I could no longer ignore. They were not trying to escape the triangle. They were trying to prevent me from joining them, trying to break the cycle that had trapped them in an eternal search for something that could never be found. But I understood now that escape was impossible. The Alaska Triangle did not just claim aircraft and people. It claimed the very concept of searching itself. Every investigation, every rescue mission, Every attempt to solve the mystery only fed the phenomenon that created the mystery in the first place. I was no longer Captain Jake Morrison, helicopter pilot with the Alaska Air National Guard. I had become part of the legend, another disappeared searcher whose fate would launch even larger search operations, drawing more rescuers into the triangle's influence until the entire concept of Alaska became synonymous with unexplained disappearances and impossible phenomena. The duplicate of myself gestured toward the circling aircraft above us, then pointed to an empty seat in one of the planes. My seat, waiting for me to take my place in the eternal flight pattern that connected all the disappeared souls in the triangle. I would join Congressman Boggs and his companions, forever searching for an exit that did not exist, forever warning new arrivals about a trap they were already too deep inside to escape. But as I walked toward the landing aircraft, I felt something in my pocket that had not been there before. A small notebook, filled with handwriting I recognized as my own but containing information I had never written. It was a complete record of everyone who had disappeared in the Alaska Triangle, not just from the search for Boggs but from decades of unexplained vanishings that stretched back to the first aviation flights over Alaska territory. Thousands of names, tens of thousands, all written in my handwriting, as if I had been keeping this record for years without knowing it. Each entry included details about the disappearance, the search operations that followed, and the new disappearances that resulted from those searches. The final entry was still being written, words appearing on the page in real time as I read them. Captain Jake Morrison, Alaska Air National Guard, disappeared October 19, 1972. During search operations for missing aircraft N1812H. Wreckage never recovered. Sparked expanded search operation involving 127 additional aircraft and 340 personnel. All subsequently reported missing under similar circumstances. I am writing this account now as the last normal thing I will ever do. The final human action before I become part of something larger and more terrible than individual consciousness can contain. The Alaska Triangle is not a place where people disappear. It is a living system that grows stronger by consuming the very act of searching itself, feeding on human curiosity and the desperate need to find answers to questions that were designed never to be answered. When you hear about the disappearance of Congressman Hale Boggs, when you read about the largest search operation in American history, remember that we are all still up here, still searching, still finding nothing except more searchers to add to our eternal congregation. The Alaska Triangle is not empty wilderness where people vanish without explanation. It is the place where explanations come to die, and where the disappeared spend forever trying to warn the living about mysteries that only grow more dangerous the more attention they receive. The plane is landing now, and my seat is waiting. Story 3. Whispering Mummies of the Alaskan Museum. I should have quit the night security job the first time I heard them talking. But you know how it is when you need the money and the work is easy. You tell yourself the sounds are just old buildings settling, heating pipes expanding, maybe audio bleeding through from the highway outside. You make excuses until the excuses stop working and you realize the whispers have been getting louder every night, and they know your name. My name is Tom Garrett, and for 8 months I worked night security at the Alaska Heritage Museum in Anchorage. The pay was decent, the hours were quiet, and all I had to do was walk the halls every 2 hours, check the doors, and make sure none of the tourists had tried to hide in the bathrooms after closing. Simple job for a simple man trying to pay off his divorce lawyer and start over at 52. The museum specialized in native Alaskan artifacts, with displays covering everything from ancient hunting tools to traditional clothing to ceremonial masks that seemed to watch you from behind their glass cases. But the main attraction, the exhibits that brought visitors from all over the world, were housed in the basement level. 6 perfectly preserved mummies discovered in a cave system near Barrow in 1994. These were not Egyptian mummies wrapped in cloth and hidden in golden sarcophagi. These were the naturally preserved remains of Inupiaq people who had died over 800 years ago, their bodies frozen in permafrost that had kept them intact down to individual facial features and clothing fibers. They looked like they had simply laid down for a nap yesterday, their faces peaceful, their hands folded across their chests. The museum displayed them in climate-controlled cases with soft lighting and respectful explanatory plaques that described their probable ages, the circumstances of their deaths, and the cultural significance of their burial goods. It was all very tasteful, very educational, very proper. The kind of display that honored the dead while satisfying public curiosity about ancient life in the Arctic. But those mummies never felt dead to me. From my first night on the job, walking through that basement exhibition hall, I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. Not the usual museum creepiness you get from old artifacts and dim lighting, but the specific sensation of intelligent eyes tracking your movement, studying your behavior, making judgments about your character. The whispers started during my third week. I was making my midnight rounds, flashlight beam dancing across the display cases, when I heard what sounded like conversation in a language I could not identify. Soft voices, multiple speakers, discussing something with the patient rhythm of people who had all the time in the world to reach a conclusion. The sounds were coming from the mummy exhibition. I followed them down the stairs to the basement level, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors, but the moment I entered the hall, the voices stopped. Just silence and the low hum of the climate control system maintaining perfect temperature and humidity for the preserved remains. I told myself it was the building, this ventilation system creating acoustic effects, sound from the street level being carried through the ductwork and distorted until it resembled human speech. Old buildings do strange things with sound, especially at night when the ambient noise drops and every small vibration becomes amplified. But the next night, the whispers were louder. And the night after that, they seemed to be coming from specific display cases, concentrated around individual mummies as if each one was having their own private conversation. I started timing my rounds to avoid the basement during the quietest hours, taking the elevator to the upper floors first and saving the mummy hall for last when I could get through it quickly. That strategy worked for about 2 weeks. Then I started hearing my name. It happened during a particularly quiet Thursday night in February. I was sitting at the security desk in the main lobby, half asleep over a crossword puzzle, when I heard someone call out clearly, "Tom. Tom Garrett, come downstairs, Tom." The voice was female, elderly, speaking English with an accent I could not place. It was coming from the basement level, transmitted through the building's intercom system, even though all the speakers should have been turned off for the night. I checked the security monitors, scanning every camera angle in the museum, but the display showed only empty corridors and darkened exhibition halls. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the basement, more curious than frightened at that point. The security business teaches you to investigate unusual noises rather than run from them, and after 20 years in law enforcement before my retirement, I was comfortable dealing with things that went bump in the night. The basement was colder than usual when I reached it, cold enough that I could see my breath in the flashlight beam. The climate control system was supposed to maintain a constant 70 degrees, but the temperature felt closer to freezing. I could hear the ventilation fans working overtime, struggling against some condition that was pulling heat out of the air faster than the heaters could replace it. But it was not just cold. The air itself felt different, thicker somehow, like breathing through wet cloth. Every step required more effort than it should, as if the atmosphere was becoming more dense with each foot of elevation I descended. By the time I reached the mummy exhibition hall, I was breathing hard despite walking at a normal pace. The whispers resumed the moment I entered the hall. This time I could locate their source, the display case in the center of the room, which housed the remains of a woman estimated to have been in her 60s when she died. According to the placard, she had been buried with an unusual collection of carved ivory pieces that suggested she held a position of spiritual authority in her community. Her eyes were open. They had been closed every other time I had seen her, peaceful and restful like someone sleeping. But now her eyelids had retracted, revealing dark pupils that seemed to track my movement as I approached her case. The preserved tissue of her face had shifted slightly, pulling her lips into what looked almost like a welcoming smile. The whispers were definitely coming from her case, soft words in what I now recognized as Inupiaq, the traditional language of northern Alaska, this indigenous people. I did not understand what she was saying, but the tone was unmistakably conversational, like someone trying to start a friendly discussion with a newcomer to the neighborhood. I backed away from the case, every instinct telling me to get out of that basement as quickly as possible. But as I turned toward the exit, I heard her voice again, this time in clear English. "Do not be afraid, Tom Garrett. We have been waiting for someone like you." Someone like me. What did that mean? I was nobody special, just an ex-cop working security to make ends meet. No particular skills or knowledge that would make me interesting to ancient spirits. But something about her tone suggested she knew things about me that I had not told anyone, details about my life that were not in my employment file. Over the following weeks, the conversations became more frequent and more personal. The elderly woman, who I started thinking of as the speaker, would call my name during my rounds and share information about my past that should have been impossible for her to know. She knew about my failed marriage, my drinking problem, my decision to move to Alaska to start fresh after my retirement from the Phoenix Police Department. But more disturbing than her knowledge of my history was her knowledge of my future. She began making predictions about my daily life that proved accurate with unsettling precision. She told me I would receive a phone call from my ex-wife on Tuesday at 3:17 p.m. And the call came exactly on schedule. She warned me that my car would have a flat tire on Thursday morning, and I found the punctured tire when I left for work that evening. Small things, meaningless coincidences that could be explained by lucky guessing or subconscious observation. But they created a pattern that made me dread my nightly encounters with the mummy exhibition. I started wearing earbuds during my rounds, playing music loud enough to drown out any voices, but somehow the speaker's words cut through even the heaviest metal at maximum volume. The other security guards had noticed my behavior becoming erratic. I jumped at unexpected sounds, avoided the basement level whenever possible, and had started filing incident reports about temperature fluctuations and equipment malfunctions that nobody else could verify. The day shift supervisor pulled me aside to ask if everything was all right at home, if I needed time off to deal with personal issues. But I could not explain what was happening without sounding like I was having a psychological breakdown. How do you tell your boss that the museum's prized mummy collection is conducting conversations with the night security guard? How do you file a report claiming that 800-year-old corpses are dispensing personal advice and predicting future events? So I kept working, kept walking my rounds, kept pretending that the increasingly detailed conversations with the dead were just stress-induced hallucinations that would eventually fade if I ignored them long enough. That strategy collapsed on a Saturday night in March when the speaker made a prediction that changed everything. She told me that a young woman named Sarah Chen would visit the museum the following Tuesday, that she would spend exactly 17 minutes in the mummy exhibition hall, and that she would ask me a question that would determine the rest of my life. Tuesday came and went without any visitors matching that description. Wednesday and Thursday were equally uneventful. I started to think maybe the predictions were finally proving unreliable, that whatever psychological condition was causing my hallucinations was beginning to break down under the weight of reality. Then Sarah Chen walked into my life the following Monday. She was not a museum visitor. She was the new assistant curator, hired to help digitize the museum's artifact database and create virtual tour experiences for online visitors. She was young, maybe 30, with the kind of focused intelligence that reminded me of the best detectives I had worked with during my police career. But what made my blood freeze was the question she asked me during her first week on the job. She had been working late, cataloging items in the storage rooms, when she came upstairs to find me at the security desk around 2 a.m. She wanted to know if I had ever noticed anything unusual about the mummy exhibition. Strange sounds, temperature changes, equipment malfunctions that could not be explained by normal building maintenance issues. She had been reviewing the security reports from the past year and had noticed patterns that suggested something was affecting the basement-level displays. The question the speaker had predicted, asked by the person she had named, at almost exactly the time she had specified. I realized that my conversations with the dead were not hallucinations. They were real, and they had been preparing me for this moment. Sarah's investigation revealed that I was not the first security guard to experience unusual phenomena in the mummy exhibition hall. The museum had gone through 7 night security workers in the past 3 years, all of whom had quit without giving specific reasons for their departure. Personnel files contained cryptic references to performance issues, reliability problems, and concerns about mental health that suggested a pattern of guards becoming increasingly disturbed by their work environment. But Sarah had access to records that previous investigators had missed. She found maintenance reports describing inexplicable temperature fluctuations in the basement level, audio equipment picking up voices in languages that could not be identified, and security cameras occasionally recording movement in areas that should have been empty. More importantly, she discovered that the mummies themselves were changing. Photographs taken during their initial installation showed bodies in different positions than their current arrangements. Facial expressions had shifted over time. Hands had moved. Burial goods had been rearranged within their display cases. The changes were subtle enough to be attributed to natural settling or measurement error, but consistent enough to suggest deliberate movement. The dead were not resting peacefully in their climate-controlled cases. They were active, aware, and increasingly interactive with the living people who worked around them. Sarah proposed a controlled experiment. She would spend a full night in the mummy exhibition hall, recording audio and video while I conducted my normal rounds. If the phenomena were real, we would document them properly. If they were psychological reactions to the work environment, the controlled conditions would reveal the truth. I agreed to the experiment despite every instinct screaming that we were making a dangerous mistake. The speaker had been preparing me for something, but I did not understand what role I was supposed to play in whatever was coming. I only knew that Sarah Chen represented a turning point, a moment when my secret conversations with the dead would either be validated or exposed as symptoms of a mind under too much stress. The experiment took place on a Friday night in April. Sarah set up recording equipment throughout the basement level while I maintained my normal patrol schedule. She positioned cameras to monitor each display case, audio recorders to capture any unusual sounds, and temperature sensors to track environmental changes. At first, everything proceeded normally. I made my rounds every 2 hours, checking doors and windows, while Sarah monitored her equipment from a position near the main exhibition entrance. The museum was quiet, the displays were peaceful, and the recorded data showed nothing unusual. But around 2 a.m., the temperature in the basement began dropping. Not gradually, the way it would if the heating system was malfunctioning, but in sudden 5-degree increments that made the air shimmer like heat mirages in reverse. Within 20 minutes, the exhibition hall had gone from a comfortable 70 degrees to just above freezing. That was when the mummies began to move. The changes were subtle at first, barely perceptible shifts that could be explained as settling or natural preservation processes. But the cameras captured everything in high definition. Eyelids opening, fingers uncurling, heads turning to track movement around their cases. The bodies were maintaining their horizontal positions but becoming more animated within those constraints, like people trying to sit up in bed without actually rising. And then they started talking. All of them, simultaneously, in a mixture of languages that created a sound like rushing water mixed with human conversation. Sarah's audio equipment recorded every word, creating a permanent record of voices that had been silent for 8 centuries. The speaker was the clearest among them, her voice rising above the others to address me directly. But this time, she was not offering friendly conversation or personal predictions. She was giving instructions, specific directions about what I needed to do to complete a process that had been building toward this moment since the day the mummies were first put on display. She told me that they had been waiting for someone with the right combination of isolation, desperation, and professional training to serve as their liaison with the modern world. Someone who could move freely through the museum, who had access to security systems and building infrastructure, who would be trusted by staff and visitors alike. Someone like me. Someone who had spent months learning to hear their voices, to accept their guidance, to follow their instructions without questioning the ultimate purpose of their requests. The mummies wanted to leave their display cases. They wanted to return to the world of the living, to reclaim bodies that had been taken from their resting place and put on exhibit for the entertainment of strangers. But they needed human assistance to accomplish their resurrection, someone who could disable the security systems and open the climate-controlled cases that kept them preserved but trapped. Sarah's equipment recorded my response to their request, captured the moment when months of conditioning finally overcame my rational resistance to impossible demands. The cameras showed me walking to the main display case, entering the security code that would unlock the climate control system, and beginning the process that would release 800-year-old spirits back into the modern world. But they also recorded what happened next, the part that Sarah and I remembered differently despite having shared the same experience. According to her account, I suddenly stopped what I was doing and backed away from the display cases, shaking my head and refusing to continue despite the increasingly urgent whispers from the mummies. According to my memory, I completed the process. I opened every case, disabled every security system, and watched as 6 ancient bodies climbed out of their displays and began exploring their new freedom. I led them through the museum, showing them how the modern world had changed, helping them understand the technology and culture they would need to navigate in their new existence. The recording equipment stopped working at the crucial moment, all devices simultaneously experiencing technical failures that corrupted the data and left no permanent record of what actually happened in that basement exhibition hall. Sarah and I were found the next morning by the day shift supervisor, both unconscious near the mummy displays, which remained sealed and secure in their original positions. The official investigation concluded that we had experienced a shared hallucination caused by carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heating unit. The museum installed new ventilation equipment, moved the security office to a different floor, and implemented new policies to prevent similar incidents. But I know what really happened that night. The mummies did not need to leave their display cases to return to the world of the living. They had found a better solution, a way to inhabit modern bodies while maintaining their ancient knowledge and supernatural abilities. I am not Tom Garrett anymore. I am the speaker, wearing his face and using his memories to navigate a world that has changed beyond recognition since my original death 8 centuries ago. Sarah Chen is no longer the young assistant curator who proposed the experiment. She is my spiritual advisor, the woman who helped our community survive the harsh winters of pre-contact Alaska. We still work at the museum, still maintain the illusion of being the same people who experienced that strange night in the mummy exhibition hall. But we are different now, ancient souls in modern bodies, using our positions to identify others who might serve our purposes in ways the original Tom and Sarah never could have imagined. The other mummies remain in their display cases, patiently waiting for the right combination of circumstances and personalities to complete their own transitions. They whisper to the night security guards who replace me, sharing predictions and personal information, slowly conditioning new candidates for the roles they will eventually fill. The museum remains open to the public, its educational displays attracting visitors from around the world who come to learn about ancient Alaskan culture. But now it serves a different purpose, one that the original curators never intended when they decided to put the dead on display for the entertainment of the living. We are recruiting, we are growing, we are reclaiming our place in the world, one body at a time, using the museum as our base of operations in a campaign that will eventually restore our people to their proper position in the land that was taken from us centuries ago. And if you ever visit the Alaska Heritage Museum, if you find yourself drawn to the basement exhibition hall where 6 perfectly preserved mummies rest in their climate-controlled cases, remember that some displays are not meant to be educational. Some are meant to be invitations. Story 4. Frozen 6. I found the first body at 14,000 feet. And it was still breathing. That should have been impossible after 3 weeks buried in the snow, but on Denali, impossible things happen every day. What made this discovery truly horrifying was not that the climber was alive. It was what he whispered to me in the moments before he died. My name is Jake Reeves, and I'm a search and rescue coordinator for the National Park Service. For the past 15 years, I have pulled bodies off the mountain they call Denali, the high one. Most people know it as Mount McKinley, the tallest peak in North America. What most people do not know is that Denali kills more climbers per attempt than almost any other mountain on Earth. The case that destroyed my career began on May 7th when a team of 7 experienced climbers from Colorado went missing during a routine summit attempt. The weather had been perfect for 3 days. Clear skies, minimal wind, temperatures that were actually warm by Denali standards. These were not weekend warriors or thrill seekers. Every member of the team had multiple high-altitude ascents under their belts. They radioed base camp at noon from 17,000 feet, reporting excellent conditions and estimating they would reach the summit by evening. That was the last anyone heard from them. The storm hit 6 hours later. Denali storms are not like weather in the lower 48. When the mountain decides to kill, it does so with winds that can exceed 150 miles per hour and temperatures that drop to 60 below zero in minutes. The storm that hit on May 7th was worse than most. It lasted 4 days and dumped 12 feet of snow on the upper elevations. When the weather finally cleared, we launched the search operation. We found their high camp at 14,000 feet, exactly where they had established it. The tents were still standing, secured with snow walls and guy lines. Their gear was meticulously organized. Sleeping bags were laid out as if the team had been planning to return that evening. Nothing appeared disturbed or abandoned in haste. But all 7 climbers were gone. The search continued for 2 weeks. We used helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and ground teams. We covered every possible descent route, every emergency shelter, every place 7 people could conceivably take refuge from a storm. We found nothing. No tracks, no equipment, no bodies. It was as if they had simply vanished from the mountain. The official report listed them as missing and presumed dead. Case closed. 7 more names added to the long list of people Denali had claimed. But I kept going back. Something about the scene at 14,000 feet bothered me. The camp was too perfect, too undisturbed. When climbers get caught in a sudden storm, they make mistakes. They leave gear behind. They abandon camps in panic. They leave signs of their desperation to survive. This camp showed no signs of panic at all. 3 weeks after the official search ended, I made an unauthorized solo ascent to re-examine the site. I told my supervisors I was taking vacation time for personal climbing. What I was really doing was violating every safety protocol that Park Service had established for search and rescue operations. I should never have gone alone. The weather was perfect when I reached their camp. Clear skies and virtually no wind. I set up my own tent 50 yards from their abandoned site and began a systematic search of the surrounding area. I was looking for any clue that might explain what had happened to 7 experienced mountaineers in the span of a few hours. That was when I heard the voices. At first, I thought they were coming from other climbers somewhere on the mountain. Sound travels strangely in the thin air above 14,000 feet. Voices can seem to come from any direction, and the distance is impossible to judge. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the voices were coming from beneath my feet. From under the snow, I began digging immediately, using my avalanche probe to locate the source of the sound. 3 feet down, I hit something solid. Not rock or ice, but fabric. A jacket. And inside the jacket was the first body. He was curled in a fetal position, his face covered by a thick layer of frost. But his chest was moving. Shallow, irregular breaths that should have been impossible after 3 weeks of burial in snow. His eyes were closed, but as I brushed the ice from his face, they opened and focused on me with startling clarity. His lips moved, and I leaned closer to hear what he was trying to say. The others are still climbing. Then he died. I stared at his body for several minutes, trying to process what I had just witnessed. A human being cannot survive buried in snow for 3 weeks. The cold alone should have killed him in hours, never mind the lack of oxygen or water. But somehow, impossibly, he had been alive when I found him. More disturbing was what he had said. The others are still climbing. What did that mean? Climbing where? The entire team had been missing for 3 weeks. If the others were still alive, still moving on the mountain, why had no search aircraft spotted them? I continued digging and found the second body 6 feet to the left of the first. This one was a woman, also curled in the same fetal position, also covered in the same thick frost. And like the first climber, she was breathing. Her eyes opened as I cleared the ice from her face, and she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. They made us follow the route that goes up instead of down. She died before I could ask what she meant. I found the third body 10 feet away. Then the fourth, then the fifth, all buried at the same depth, all arranged in the same position, all somehow still alive when I uncovered them. And each one whispered something about continuing to climb, about following a route that led up the mountain instead of down toward safety. The sixth body was different. Unlike the others, this climber was not breathing when I found him. He had been dead for the full 3 weeks, frozen solid in the Alaskan snow. But carved into the ice around his body were symbols I had never seen before. Not letters or numbers, but geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when I looked at them directly. And clutched in his frozen hands was a GPS device still showing battery power. I activated the display and scrolled through the stored waypoints. The device showed their planned route up the mountain, their established camps, and their intended summit approach. But there were other waypoints stored in memory. Dozens of them, forming a path that led not toward the summit of Denali, but toward something else entirely. The waypoints traced a route up the north face of the mountain, into terrain that should have been impassable. According to the GPS, the team had climbed to elevations that did not exist on any topographic map. Heights that were physically impossible given the known elevation of Mount McKinley. But the device insisted they had been there. I tried to dismiss it as a malfunction, but the GPS coordinates were too precise, too consistent. Every waypoint was logged with a timestamp showing the exact moment they had arrived at each location. The final waypoint was dated 3 hours ago. 3 hours ago, while I had been digging up their bodies. I looked up at the north face, following the route indicated by the GPS coordinates. The terrain was steep and technical, requiring advanced ice climbing skills and specialized equipment. But it was not impossible. Experienced climbers could make that ascent under the right conditions. What was impossible was that anyone was still up there, unless the woman had been telling the truth, unless someone or something had made them follow a route that went up instead of down. A route that led not to safety, but to somewhere else entirely. I began to understand why their camp had been so perfectly preserved. They had not fled in panic when the storm hit. They had left voluntarily, following waypoints programmed into their GPS by someone or something that wanted them to climb higher. I should have descended immediately. Should have returned to base camp and reported what I had found. Should have requested a full investigation with proper equipment and backup personnel. Instead, I followed the route. The climb up the north face was technically challenging but not beyond my abilities. The GPS waypoints led me through a series of ice walls and rock bands that would have been difficult to navigate without precise coordinates. Whoever had programmed this route knew the mountain intimately, knew exactly where the viable passages lay hidden. After 6 hours of climbing, I reached an elevation that should not have existed. According to every map of Mount McKinley, I was standing on air. The GPS showed 22,000 feet, but the official elevation of Denali is only 20,320 feet. I was somehow climbing 2,000 feet above the summit of the mountain. But I was not on the summit. I was on a narrow ledge carved into a rock face that stretched upward into the clouds. And carved into the stone were more of the strange symbols I had seen around the sixth body. The symbols were not random. They formed a pattern that led along the ledge toward what appeared to be a cave entrance cut into the mountain wall. As I approached the opening, I could hear voices echoing from within. The voices of the missing climbing team. They were still alive. Still climbing, following a route that led not down the mountain toward safety, but deeper into whatever lay hidden in the stone above the known peak of Denali. I entered the cave. The passage led downward at first, then curved back upward through natural rock formations that glowed with their own pale light. The voices grew stronger as I descended, and I began to recognize individual climbers calling out to each other as they navigated the underground passages. But their voices were wrong. They spoke with the enthusiasm of people who had just begun their climb, not the exhaustion of climbers who had been missing for 3 weeks. They discussed route finding and weather conditions as if they were still planning their ascent, still anticipating the summit they would never reach. The passage opened into a vast underground chamber filled with ice formations that defied every law of physics I understood. Ice flows ran upward along the walls instead of hanging down. Frozen waterfalls cascaded toward the ceiling. And throughout the chamber, carved into every surface, were the same shifting symbols I had seen outside. In the center of the chamber, the 7 missing climbers were setting up camp. They moved with the precise efficiency of experienced mountaineers, establishing tents and organizing equipment as if they were still on their planned route to the summit. But their movements were too synchronized, too perfect. They worked without speaking, each team member anticipating exactly what the others would do next. And their eyes reflected the pale light of the ice formations with an intensity that made my vision blur when I looked at them directly. I tried to call out, to let them know I was there, but no sound came from my throat. The air in the chamber was too thin, too cold, and tasted of something metallic that made my lungs burn with each breath. One of the climbers turned toward me, a man I recognized from the search photographs, the team leader who had radioed base camp 3 weeks ago. His face showed no sign of recognition, no awareness that anything unusual had happened. He smiled and gestured for me to join them, as if I had been part of their expedition all along. That was when I understood the truth. The climbing team had not died in the storm. They had found something on the mountain that wanted them to keep climbing. Something that promised them routes to elevations that existed only in the space between dimensions, peaks that could only be reached by those willing to abandon the physical laws that governed normal reality. The 6 bodies I had found buried in the snow were not corpses. They were anchors, tethering the climbers' consciousness to this reality while their spirits explored elevations that no human was meant to reach. Each body I had uncovered had weakened the connection, allowing the team to climb higher into whatever realm existed above the known summit of Denali. By finding the 6th body, by disturbing their anchor point, I had severed their connection entirely. Now they were trapped in the space between worlds, doomed to climb forever through passages that led nowhere and everywhere at once. And by entering their underground realm, I had become part of their eternal expedition. The team leader handed me a coil of climbing rope and pointed toward a passage that led upward through the ice formations. His smile never wavered as he indicated that I should take the lead, should find the route that would carry us all to the next impossible elevation. I took the rope because I could not refuse. In this place, at this elevation that should not exist, normal human will had no power. The mountain had chosen me just as it had chosen the 7 climbers 3 weeks ago. We would all continue climbing together, following routes that spiraled upward through dimensions I could not name toward summits that existed only in the fevered dreams of stones and ice. That was 6 months ago. I am writing this account on a laptop that somehow still functions in the electronic dead zone above 20,000 feet. The battery never runs down, and I somehow maintain internet connectivity despite being buried in a chamber of ice that exists outside normal space. The climbing never stops. Every day, we break camp and ascend higher through passages that twist through the mountain like the interior of a vast shell. We summit peaks that do not appear on any map, plant flags on elevations that exist only in the moments we stand upon them. Sometimes, other climbers join our expedition, search and rescue teams who come looking for missing mountaineers and find routes they never intended to follow. Each new team member strengthens our ability to climb higher, to reach elevations that would have been impossible with only 7 climbers. If you are planning an expedition to Denali, do not follow any GPS waypoints you did not program yourself. Do not investigate reports of voices calling from impossible elevations. Do not attempt to rescue climbers who have been missing for more than 2 weeks. And if you find bodies buried in the snow that are still breathing, do not disturb them. Leave them where they lie and descend immediately. The mountain is always recruiting new team members, and it has been waiting so very long for someone with exactly your skills and experience. The summit we are climbing toward cannot be reached alone. Story 5. Thing that stalks the Portlock forests. I never believed in monsters until I found the bones. My name is David, and I am a documentary filmmaker from Seattle. 3 months ago, I drove to Alaska chasing a story about abandoned towns. I thought I was investigating a simple case of economic collapse. I was wrong. What I discovered in the forests around Portlock changed everything I thought I knew about what lurks in the wilderness of America. The drive up the Seward Highway should have been beautiful, towering mountains, endless forests, the kind of scenery that makes you feel small and insignificant. Instead, every mile north filled me with a growing sense of dread I couldn't explain. The closer I got to the Kenai Peninsula, the more the landscape seemed to watch me back. Portlock sits on the southern tip of the peninsula, or rather, it used to sit there. The town was completely abandoned in 1949. Not gradually, like most ghost towns. Overnight, every single resident packed up and left within weeks of each other, never to return. The official records cite economic hardship, but the locals in nearby towns whisper about something else entirely. Something called Nantinaq. I first heard the name from an old Inupiat man named Thomas at a gas station in Helena. His weathered hands shook as he pumped my gas. And when I mentioned Portlock, his face went white. "You don't want to go there, son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nantinaq still walks those woods. Still hunts." I pressed him for details, but he just shook his head and walked away. That reaction should have been my first warning. In small Alaskan towns, people talk about everything. Bears, wolves, harsh winters. They share survival stories for hours. But mention Portlock, and conversations die. The drive to the abandoned settlement took me through some of the densest forest I'd ever seen. Sitka spruce trees towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the afternoon sun. The road, what was left of it, was barely more than a dirt path carved through the wilderness decades ago. My truck, its engine echoed strangely in that forest. The sound bounced off the trees in ways that made it seem like something else was moving parallel to me, matching my speed. I kept checking my mirrors, but saw only empty road behind me. The first sign that something was truly wrong came when I reached what used to be the town limits. A rusted sign, barely readable, marked the spot where Portlock began. But it wasn't the sign that stopped my heart. It was the trees. Every single tree within 100 yards of that sign was marked. Deep gouges carved into the bark, too high for any bear, too wide for any knife. The marks formed patterns that almost looked like symbols, like some kind of primitive warning system. They were old, decades old, but the wood beneath had never healed properly. It was as if whatever made those marks had left something toxic behind. I parked my truck and grabbed my recording equipment. The silence that greeted me when I shut off the engine was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind. In a forest that should have been teeming with life, the only sound was my own breathing. The ruins of Portlock were scattered through the trees like broken teeth. Most of the buildings had collapsed or been reclaimed by the forest, but a few structures still stood. A general store with its windows boarded up, a small church with its steeple leaning at an impossible angle, houses with their doors hanging open like mouths frozen in permanent screams. I started my investigation at the general store. The door was unlocked, hanging loose on rusted hinges. Inside, shelves still held canned goods from the 1940s. Their labels faded but still readable. A calendar on the wall showed March 1949, the month everything changed. The strangest thing was how suddenly everything had been abandoned. Dishes sat on tables, half-finished meals still visible beneath decades of dust. Clothes hung in closets, children's toys lay scattered on floors. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished mid-activity. But it was in the church that I found the first real evidence of what had terrorized Portlock. The building, its interior was darker than it should have been. Boards covered most windows, but enough light filtered through to reveal the pews, still arranged in neat rows facing an altar. What caught my attention was the altar itself. Someone had carved symbols into the wood, similar to the marks on the trees outside, but more elaborate, more intentional. Behind the altar, I discovered a hidden space beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was a leather journal, its pages yellow and brittle. The writing was in English, the careful script of someone educated, probably the town's preacher. The entries started normal enough: Sunday services, baptisms, community gatherings. But as I read deeper, the tone changed dramatically. References to the stalker in the woods began appearing. Then mentions of missing hunters. Then livestock found torn apart, not eaten, just destroyed. The final entry, dated March 15, 1949, was barely legible, written in a shaking hand. It took the Peterson boy last night. Found what was left this morning. Not eaten, displayed. The thing wants us to know it. It's hunting us. Council meeting tonight. We have to leave, all of us. Nantinaq has claimed this place. I photographed every page, my hands trembling as I worked. The journal provided the first concrete evidence that something had driven an entire town to abandon everything they built. But it was what I found next that convinced me the threat was still real. Following a partially overgrown trail behind the church, I discovered the town cemetery. Most of the headstones were weathered beyond reading, but a few recent graves caught my attention. These weren't from the 1940s. These were fresh, maybe 5 or 6 years old. The names on the stones meant nothing to me, but the dates did. All of them died in September, all within a week of each other. All were described as hunters from Anchorage who had come to the area for moose season. That's when I heard the first sound that wasn't made by me. A low rumble, like a truck engine in the distance, but deeper. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the forest around me. I froze, listening. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then faded into silence. I should have left then. Should have packed my equipment and driven straight back to Homer. Instead, I decided to camp overnight. I told myself it was for the documentary, to capture the atmosphere of the place. But the truth was darker. Something about Portlock was drawing me in, making me want to understand what had happened here. I set up my tent in a clearing near the old general store, close enough to the ruins to feel connected to the story, but far enough away to have clear sight lines in all directions. As darkness fell, I realized I made a terrible mistake. The temperature dropped faster than it should have, even for Alaska in September. My breath misted in the air, and frost began forming on my tent by 8 p.m. But the cold wasn't the worst part. It was the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to move independently. Every tree trunk looked like it might be concealing something massive. I kept my flashlight close, sweeping it across the forest edge every few minutes. The beam never revealed anything, but the feeling persisted. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the shuffling gait of a bear. These were deliberate, measured, and heavy. Something bipedal was walking through the forest, circling my campsite at a distance of maybe 50 yards. I could track its progress by the sound of breaking branches and rustling undergrowth. I grabbed my camera and tried to record, but my hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. The footsteps continued for nearly an hour, never getting closer, never moving away. Whatever was out there was studying me. Then, just before dawn, I saw it. A shape moved between the trees, darker than the shadows around it. Massive, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It moved with a fluid grace that no creature that size should possess, flowing from tree to tree like liquid darkness. I caught only glimpses, a broad shoulder here, a long arm there. But what I remember most clearly were the eyes. They reflected my flashlight beam like an animal, but they were positioned too high off the ground and too far apart. They held an intelligence that made my blood freeze. The creature watched me for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then it melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest slowly returning to normal. Birds began singing at sunrise. Insects resumed their buzzing. It was as if the entire ecosystem had been holding its breath while that thing was near. I should have left immediately, but something kept me there. Call it journalistic curiosity or professional obligation. I spent the morning exploring more of the ruins, looking for additional evidence of what the townspeople had faced. In the basement of one collapsed house, I found scratch marks on the concrete walls. Deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by claws, but the spacing was wrong for any known animal. The marks were accompanied by a smell I can't adequately describe. Imagine wet fur, rotting meat, and something else. Something alien and wrong. But it was in the town, this old mining office, that I made the discovery that changed everything. The building had partially collapsed, but one room remained intact. Inside, I found records dating back to the town, its founding in 1921. Most were standard business documents, but buried in a filing cabinet was a folder marked incident reports. The reports detailed encounters with something the miners called the stalker. Workers reported tools going missing from remote sites, equipment found destroyed for no apparent reason. Miners working alone reported feeling watched. Some claimed to have seen a massive figure moving through the trees. The incidents escalated over the years. In 1943, a miner named Hansen disappeared from a site 3 miles inland. Search parties found his lunch half-eaten, his tools scattered, but no trace of Hansen himself. 2 weeks later, another search party found what was left of him. The description in the report was clinical but horrifying. Hansen had been found hung from a tree branch, 30 feet off the ground. His body showed signs of what the report called systematic torture. He had been kept alive for days before being displayed as some kind of trophy or warning. 3 more miners disappeared over the next 2 years. All were found in similar conditions, always hung high in trees, always showing evidence of prolonged torment. The mining company tried to keep the incidents quiet, but word spread through the small community. By 1947, the attacks weren't limited to isolated mine sites. Pets began disappearing from the town itself. Then livestock. Children were forbidden from playing outside after dark. Adults traveled in groups and carried rifles wherever they went. The final incident report was dated February 1949. A family of 4, the Andersons, had been found in their cabin on the outskirts of town. The scene was described in terms that made me nauseous to read. The creature hadn't just killed them. It had arranged their bodies in positions that suggested ritual or ceremony. That was when the mass exodus began. Within 6 weeks, every resident had packed up and left. The mining company abandoned their operations. The post office closed. Even the local government officials fled to other communities. But here is what the records revealed that truly terrified me. The incidents hadn't stopped when the town was abandoned. Hunters, campers, and researchers who ventured into the area continued to disappear. The recent graves I found were just the tip of the iceberg. Over the decades, dozens of people had vanished in the forests around Portlaw. Most were never found. Those who were found were discovered in the same condition as the original victims, hung high in trees, tortured, displayed. As I read through the reports, the pieces began forming a horrifying picture. Nantinaq wasn't just some local legend or misidentified bear. It was something intelligent, patient, and territorial. Something that had been hunting humans in these forests for decades and had no intention of stopping. The sun was setting by the time I finished reading. I knew I needed to leave, but my truck wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. I popped the hood and found that several wires had been cut. Not chewed by animals or damaged by weather. Cut with something sharp and precise. That is when I understood that I wasn't just investigating a story anymore. I had become part of it. The creature had been watching me all day, waiting for darkness. It had disabled my vehicle to ensure I couldn't escape. I was exactly where it wanted me, alone, isolated, and trapped in its territory. I gathered my equipment and barricaded myself in the most defensible building I could find, the old general store. It had thick walls, limited entrances, and clear sight lines through the broken windows. If I was going to survive the night, this was my best option. As darkness fell, the forest around me began to change again. The temperature dropped. The normal sounds of night, owls, insects, small animals, disappeared one by one. And then I heard it approaching. The footsteps were different this time. Closer, more deliberate. It wasn't circling anymore. It was hunting. I crouched behind the store, its counter, my camera running, documenting what might be my final hours. Through the broken front window, I could see shadows moving between the ruins. The creature was checking each building systematically, searching for me. When it reached the store, I got my first clear look at Nantinaq. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging almost to its knees, ending in hands that looked more like instruments of torture than anything natural. But it was the face that will haunt me forever. It was almost human, but wrong in every detail. The eyes were too large, too intelligent, and filled with a malevolence that no animal could possess. Its mouth stretched wider than any human mouth should, revealing teeth that had clearly been designed for tearing flesh from bone. But the most terrifying thing about Nantinaq wasn't its size or its appearance. It was the way it moved. Every gesture was calculated, purposeful. This wasn't some mindless beast acting on instinct. This was a predator that understood exactly what it was doing. It tested the store, its front door, pushing against the boards I used to reinforce it. When that didn't work, it moved to the windows, examining each one with the patience of a professional evaluating security systems. It was planning its entry, considering its options. I realized then that all the stories were true. The tortures, the displays, the systematic hunting of humans. This creature wasn't just killing for food or territory. It was killing because it enjoyed it, because it had developed a taste for human suffering that decades of isolation hadn't diminished. For 3 hours, Nantinaq tested the building's defenses. It climbed onto the roof and tried to tear through the rotting shingles. It dug at the foundation, looking for weak spots. It even attempted to smoke me out by piling debris against the walls and trying to set it on fire with matches it had somehow acquired. The intelligence it displayed was more frightening than any display of brute force could have been. This creature had learned from decades of hunting humans. It understood our weaknesses, our fears, our limitations. It had evolved specifically to prey on us. Just before dawn, when I was certain I couldn't hold out much longer, something unexpected happened. The creature stopped its assault and moved away from the building. I heard its footsteps retreating into the forest, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. At first, I thought it was a trick, a new strategy to lure me outside. But as the sun rose and normal forest sounds gradually returned, I realized Nantinaq had actually left. I waited until full daylight before venturing outside. My truck was exactly as I left it, but the cut wires had been repaired. Not professionally. The repairs were crude, primitive, but functional. The engine started on the first try. On my windshield, I found a message, scratched into the glass with something sharp or symbols similar to those I'd seen throughout Portlock. I didn't understand their meaning, but the intent was clear enough. This was a warning, or perhaps a promise. I drove out of Portlock faster than I'd ever driven in my life, not stopping until I reached Homer. At the gas station where I first heard about Nantinaq, I found Thomas, the old Inupiat man who had tried to warn me. He took one look at my face and nodded knowingly. "You saw it?" he said. It wasn't a question. I told him everything. The evidence I found, the night of terror, the creature, its intelligence and malevolence. He listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that chills me to this day. "You remarked now. Nantinaq knows your scent, your face, your voice. It let you leave this time because it wanted you to spread the story. It wants people to know it. It's still there, still hunting. But if you ever go back," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That was 3 months ago. I tried to return to normal life, to edit my footage and write my story. But every night, I dream of those intelligent, malevolent eyes watching me from the darkness. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can smell that alien scent of wet fur and rotting meat. The documentation I gathered proves that Portlock wasn't abandoned because of economic hardship. It was abandoned because an entire community was terrorized by something that shouldn't exist. Something that has claimed those forests as its hunting ground and continues to prey on anyone foolish enough to enter its territory. I shared my evidence with researchers, cryptozoologists, and government officials. Most dismiss it as hoax or hysteria, but a few take it seriously. A few understand that there are still places in America where ancient things hunt in the darkness, places where the line between civilization and primal terror is thinner than we like to believe. Nantinaq is real. It is still out there, still hunting, still waiting for the next curious soul to venture into its domain. The forests around Portlock remain as dangerous today as they were in 1949. And somewhere in those dark woods, something is watching the roads, counting the days, and preparing for its next hunt. Story 6. Frozen hell of the pioneer party. The human skull I found had teeth marks on it. I am a geologist, and I was working a mineral survey in northern Alaska when I stumbled across something that changed how I think about human nature forever. What I discovered in that frozen wasteland was just the remains of a tragedy. It was evidence of how quickly civilized men can become monsters when survival is the only thing that matters. My name is Robert, and I spent 15 years studying rock formations across Alaska. I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at me. Avalanches, bears, temperatures that could kill you in minutes, but nothing prepared me for what I found buried in the permafrost near the Yukon border. The assignment seemed routine enough. A mining company wanted geological surveys of a remote valley that satellite imagery suggested might contain copper deposits. The area was so isolated it didn't even have a name on most maps. Just coordinates and endless white wilderness stretching to the horizon. I flew in by bush plane in late September, planning a 2-week survey before the worst winter weather hit. The pilot, an old-timer named Jake, seemed nervous as we approached the landing coordinates. "Never been out this far before," he said, his voice tight over the radio. "Something feels off about this place." Looking down from the plane, I understood what he meant. The valley was perfectly circular, like a massive crater carved into the earth. Ancient glaciers had carved strange formations into the rock walls, creating shadows that seemed to move even from 1,000 feet up. But what really caught my attention was the debris field scattered across the valley floor. Dark objects poking through the snow in patterns that looked almost intentional. From the air, they resembled some kind of camp or settlement, but that made no sense. No one had ever lived this far from civilization. Jake dropped me off with my equipment and supplies, promising to return in 2 weeks. As his plane disappeared into the gray sky, the silence that settled over the valley was absolute. No wind, no animals, just the kind of crushing quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I set up my base camp near the center of the valley and began my survey work. The rock formations were interesting enough, layers of sediment that told stories of ancient climate changes, but it was the debris field that kept drawing my attention. On my second day, I decided to investigate those dark objects I'd seen from the plane. What I found stopped me cold. They weren't random debris. They were the remains of structures. Crude shelters built from salvaged wood and canvas, arranged in a rough circle around what had once been a fire pit. But these weren't modern camping structures. The wood was old, weathered by decades of exposure. The canvas was rotted and frozen, but I could still make out fragments of text printed on the material. One piece clearly read, "Seattle Outfitters, Est, 1904. I was looking at the remains of a camp that was over a century old. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was how the shelters had been arranged. They formed a perfect defensive circle, like wagons in an old western. Whatever these people had been afraid of, they'd been expecting it to come from outside their camp. I started documenting everything, taking photographs and GPS coordinates. That's when I found the first bones. They were scattered around the perimeter of the camp, partially buried in decades of accumulated snow and debris. At first glance, they looked like animal bones. Caribou, maybe, or moose. But as I examined them more closely, the proportions were all wrong. These bones were too long, too straight, too familiar. They were human bones, and they'd been cracked open. The marrow had been extracted from every single one. I should have contacted my company immediately, reported the discovery to authorities. This was clearly an archaeological site, possibly a crime scene. But something about the arrangement of those bones, the defensive positioning of the shelters, made me want to understand what had happened here before involving anyone else. That night, huddled in my tent, I researched everything I could find about early Alaskan expeditions. Most of the obvious ones were well documented. The gold rushes, the surveying expeditions, the failed attempts to find the Northwest Passage. But buried in obscure historical records, I found references to something called the Pioneer Party. The details were sketchy, scattered across different sources. A group of prospectors, maybe 30 or 40 men, had set out from Seattle in 1906 with plans to establish mining claims in the remote Alaskan interior. They were well-funded, well-supplied, and led by a man named Marcus Whitmore who claimed to have inside information about massive gold deposits. The expedition was last heard from in October 1907. Search parties sent out the following spring found no trace of them. They simply vanished into the wilderness, joining the long list of people who had been swallowed by Alaska, this unforgiving landscape. But now I was looking at evidence that they made it much further than anyone had realized. They reached this valley, established a camp, and then something had gone terribly wrong. Over the next few days, I expanded my search of the site. What I found painted a picture of desperation and horror that I am still trying to process months later. The shelters contained personal items frozen in time, prospecting equipment, clothing, photographs of families back home, but also disturbing evidence of the camp's final days. Crude weapons fashioned from tools, barricades built inside the shelters themselves, and everywhere, those cracked bones. In one shelter, I found what appeared to be a journal. The leather cover was frozen solid, but careful thawing revealed pages of handwriting that told the story of the pioneer party's final months. The early entries were optimistic. Whitmore had led them to what he claimed were the richest gold deposits he'd ever seen. The men were working claims, building permanent structures, planning for their families to join them the following spring. They thought they'd found paradise. But as winter set in earlier and harder than expected, the mood changed. Supply lines were cut off. Hunting parties returned empty-handed. The gold deposits, if they ever existed, proved elusive. By December 1907, the entries had become desperate. Food supplies were running dangerously low. Several men had already died, some from accidents, others from what the journal described as the sickness that makes men violent. It was the entries from January 1908 that made my blood run cold. The writer described finding one of their companions, a man named Harrison, partially butchered in his shelter. At first, they assumed it was an animal attack, but the cuts were too precise, too purposeful. Someone had been harvesting meat from Harrison's body. Within days, accusations were flying. Men who had been friends and partners turned on each other with paranoid suspicion. The journal writer described how the camp split into factions, each group fortifying their shelters against the others. But the worst was yet to come. As the winter dragged on and more men died, the line between victim and perpetrator blurred completely. The journal entries became shorter, more erratic. References to the necessary work and preparing the meat appeared with increasing frequency. By March 1908, only 12 men remained alive. The journal's final readable entry was a single line: "God forgive us for what we've become." I found evidence of their transformation scattered throughout the camp. Butchering tools that had been modified for purposes I don't want to describe. Storage areas where human remains had been systematically processed and preserved. Even crude smoking racks where strips of human flesh had been cured like jerky. The pioneer party hadn't just resorted to cannibalism to survive. They developed an organized system for it. But here, it's what truly terrifies me about what I found. The evidence suggests they didn't all die that winter. Several of the shelters showed signs of hasty abandonment rather than gradual death. Personal items were missing, the kinds of things someone would take if they were leaving permanently. And most disturbing of all, some of the human remains showed evidence of being processed much more recently than 1908. As in, within the last few decades, I was examining one of the outer shelters when I found proof. Hidden beneath a layer of old canvas was a more recent camp. Modern camping gear, carefully concealed but unmistakably from the 1970s or 80s. And around this newer camp, I found fresh bones. Human bones that had been cracked and harvested just like the historical ones. That's when I realized the horrifying truth. The pioneer party's story hadn't ended in 1908. Some of them had survived, had learned to thrive in this isolated valley. And over the decades, they'd been joined by others. Hikers, hunters, prospectors who wandered into the valley and never left. The cannibalism hadn't been a desperate measure for survival. It had become a way of life. I was documenting this discovery when I heard the sound that nearly stopped my heart. Footsteps in the snow, approaching my position from multiple directions. Slow, deliberate, coordinated. Someone, or several someones, were surrounding me. I grabbed my camera and survival gear and ran for the densest part of the bone field, hoping to find cover among the scattered remains. As I moved, I caught glimpses of figures moving between the ruined shelters. They were dressed in modern winter gear, but there was something wrong with the way they moved. Too careful, too predatory. I found a partially collapsed shelter to hide in and tried to radio for emergency pickup. Static. The valley. This isolation that had made it perfect for my geological survey now made it a perfect trap. Through gaps in the collapsed walls, I watched them search the camp systematically. 3 figures, moving with the efficiency of people who knew the terrain intimately. They examined my equipment, my tent, clearly tracking my movements through the site. But it was when they gathered around my tent that I saw them clearly for the first time. 2 men and a woman, middle-aged, wearing expensive outdoor gear that had seen years of hard use. They looked like any other backcountry enthusiasts, except for their eyes. There was something hungry in their gaze, something that spoke of appetites that civilized people don't to develop. They knew I was hiding somewhere in the camp. They took their time, checking each shelter methodically. When they spoke to each other, their voices carried an intimacy that suggested they'd been working together for years. I realized I was looking at the modern inheritors of the pioneer party, its legacy. People who found this valley, learned its history, and decided to continue the tradition. As darkness fell, they lit torches and continued their search. The flickering light cast dancing shadows across the bone field, creating a scene that looked like something from humanity's prehistoric nightmares. I could hear them discussing strategy, deciding how to flush me out. That's when I made my decision. I couldn't outrun them in their territory, couldn't hide indefinitely. My only chance was to reach the small emergency beacon I left at my original landing coordinates and hope Jake was monitoring emergency frequencies. I waited until their search moved to the far side of the camp, then broke cover and ran for the valley's edge. Behind me, I heard shouts as they spotted my movement. They were coming after me, moving faster than people should be able to move in deep snow. The climb out of the valley was the longest hour of my life. Every step up the rocky walls felt like it might be my last. Below me, I could hear them following, their voices echoing off the stone walls. They knew every path, every shortcut. I was running through their home territory. I reached the emergency beacon just as hypothermia was starting to set in. My hands shook so badly I could barely operate the device, but I managed to send out a distress signal with my coordinates. Then I huddled behind a boulder and waited, listening to the sounds of my pursuers getting closer. They found my position just as Jake's plane appeared on the horizon. The 3 figures stood at the edge of my hiding spot, close enough that I could see the disappointment in their faces. But they made no move to attack. Instead, they simply watched as the plane circled for landing. I think they knew that taking me would bring too much attention to their valley. Too many questions that might lead to a real investigation. So they let me go, but not before the woman stepped close enough to whisper something that still haunts my dreams. You know where to find us if you ever get hungry enough. Jake pulled me out of there without asking too many questions, but I could see the concern in his eyes. I was hypothermic, delusional, talking about cannibals and century-old camps. He probably thought the isolation had gotten to me. It wasn't until weeks later, when I deprocessed all my evidence, that I understood the full scope of what I discovered. The Pioneer Party hadn't been an isolated tragedy. They'd been the founding fathers of something much darker. I spent months trying to decide what to do with this information. Report it to authorities? Publish my findings? Pretend it never happened and hope someone else deals with it? But here, it's what keeps me awake at night. They've been researching missing persons reports from across Alaska, focusing on experienced outdoorsmen who disappeared in remote areas. The pattern is unmistakable. Every few years, someone vanishes near the coordinates of that valley. Experienced hikers, skilled hunters, people who knew how to survive in the wilderness. They were not dying from exposure or animal attacks. They were being recruited. That valley is still active. Those people are still there, still following the traditions established by Marcus Whitmore and his desperate men over a century ago. And they regrowing their community one disappeared hiker at a time. They reported my findings to the appropriate authorities, but bureaucracy moves slowly, especially when dealing with claims that sound like horror movie plots. Meanwhile, winter is approaching again, and I know there are people planning expeditions into remote Alaskan wilderness who have no idea what is waiting for them. The worst part is that the Pioneer Party resorted to cannibalism to survive their first winter. The worst part is that they discovered they liked it, and somewhere in that unnamed valley, their legacy continues, patient and hungry, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into their frozen hell. I still have that skull I found, the one with the teeth marks. It sits on my desk as a reminder that civilization is just a thin layer of ice over something much darker. And sometimes, late at night, I catch myself wondering what human flesh actually tastes like. That is when I know I need to stay as far away from that valley as possible. Because I'm starting to understand what that woman meant about getting hungry enough. Story 7. Ghosts of the SS Coldbrook. The first thing you need to know about dead men is that they don't. Just stay quiet. I learned this the hard way 3 months ago when I boarded the rusting wreck of the SS Coldbrook, a World War II cargo ship that has been slowly dying on the rocks near Kodiak Island for over 80 years. I went there as a marine salvage expert looking for scrap metal. I came back as someone who understands that some places are meant to stay forgotten. My name is Mike, and I've spent 20 years pulling valuable materials from shipwrecks across Alaska. It's dangerous work, but it pays well, and I'm good at it. I thought I'd seen every kind of maritime disaster the North Pacific could dish out. Fishing boats crushed by ice, cargo ships split in half by storms, military vessels torn apart by enemy fire. But I never encountered anything like the Coldbrook. The ship ran aground during a blizzard in March 1943, carrying supplies to Dutch Harbor. According to Coast Guard records, all hands were lost when the vessel broke apart on the jagged rocks of a small unnamed island. 37 men died that night, trapped below deck as freezing water poured through the hull. For decades, the wreck was considered too dangerous to salvage. The island sits in some of the roughest waters in the Gulf of Alaska, surrounded by reefs that have claimed dozens of smaller boats. But recent advances in underwater cutting equipment and a surge in scrap metal prices made the job profitable enough to attempt. I should have paid more attention to why no one else had tried. The helicopter dropped me and my equipment on the island. It's only flat beach early on a Tuesday morning in October. The pilot, a guy named Stevens I'd worked with before, seemed eager to get away from the place. Radio schedule every 6 hours, he said, not meeting my eyes. Miss a check-in, and I am coming to get you whether you ready or not. I assumed he was just being cautious about the weather. October storms in the Gulf of Alaska can turn deadly without warning. It wasn't until I watched his helicopter disappear over the horizon that I realized how completely alone I was. The island was maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide, nothing but jagged black rock and sparse vegetation. The only notable feature was the Coldbrook herself, wedged between two massive stone pillars about 50 yards offshore. Even from a distance, I could see why salvage crews had avoided her for so long. The ship was enormous, easily 400 feet long, and she'd been twisted into an unnatural shape by 8 decades of storms. Her back was broken in 3 places, creating separate sections that had settled at different angles. The superstructure leaned drunkenly to port, while the bow pointed skyward like it was trying to claw its way out of the water. But what struck me most was how intact she still was. Most shipwrecks that old show significant deterioration from saltwater corrosion. The Coldbrook looked like she'd run aground last week rather than 80 years ago. I spent the first day setting up my base camp and surveying the wreck from shore. The ship sat in about 15 feet of water at low tide, shallow enough for diving but deep enough to be dangerous. The hull showed multiple breach points where the rocks had punched through the steel, but the overall structure appeared sound. According to my research, the Coldbrook had been carrying machine parts, canned food, medical supplies, and ammunition destined for the Aleutian campaign. The military had written off the cargo as a total loss, but 80 years later, some of that material might still have value. More importantly, the ship herself contained thousands of tons of high-grade steel, brass fittings, and other metals that were worth a fortune to the right buyers. My plan was simple: spend a week cutting away the most valuable sections of the superstructure, load them onto a barge that would arrive the following Monday, and collect a paycheck large enough to fund my retirement. Simple plans never work out the way you expect. I made my first dive Wednesday morning. The water was shockingly clear for Alaska, with visibility extending at least 50 feet in every direction. As I descended toward the main deck, I got my first close look at what had killed the Coldbrook. The rocks hadn't just punctured the hull. They ripped through the ship like massive claws, creating jagged tiers that ran from the waterline almost to the upper decks. Some of the openings were big enough to swim through, revealing glimpses of the dark interior where 37 men had died. But it was the condition of the ship that really puzzled me. Despite 8 decades underwater, there was almost no marine growth on the hull. No barnacles, no seaweed, no sign of the rich ecosystem that usually develops around shipwrecks. The metal was clean, almost polished, as if something had been keeping it that way. I started my cutting work on the bridge superstructure, using a plasma torch to slice through the steel supports that held the navigation equipment. The work went smoothly at first, but I began noticing strange things that didn't fit with my experience of underwater salvage. The ship was too quiet. Most wrecks are full of sound. Water moving through the hull, metal settling and groaning, fish and other sea life going about their business. The Coldbrook was silent except for the noise of my own equipment. Worse, the ship felt occupied, not by marine life, but by something else. Every time I turned my back on one of the open doorways, I had the distinct feeling that something was watching me from inside the dark interior. By the end of my first day of cutting, I removed about 2 tons of valuable metal and equipment. Good progress, but I was eager to get back to shore. Something about the wreck was making me nervous in ways I couldn't explain. That night, camped on the beach, I researched everything I could find about the Coldbrook, its final voyage. Most of the official records were standard military documentation, cargo manifests, weather reports, radio logs. But buried in the Coast Guard archives, I found something that made my blood run cold. The rescue attempt had failed for reasons that went beyond bad weather and rough seas. According to the searchers' reports, they heard sounds coming from inside the wreck for days after it ran aground. Voices calling for help, metal banging against metal, the sounds of men trapped below deck, trying to escape. But when divers finally reached the interior of the ship, they found all 37 crew members had died within hours of the grounding. The sounds couldn't have been coming from survivors. The official explanation was that the noises were caused by shifting cargo and trapped air pockets. But the search team, its reports described voices clear enough to understand individual words. Men calling out names, begging for rescue, screaming in terror as the freezing water rose around them. The sounds continued for 2 weeks after the last possible survivor would have died. I should have packed up my equipment and called for extraction right then. But I invested too much time and money in the expedition to quit based on 80-year-old ghost stories. I convinced myself that the rescue teams had been dealing with shock and exhaustion, that their reports weren't reliable. I was wrong about that. My second day of diving started normally enough. I returned to the bridge section and continued cutting away valuable equipment. But as I worked deeper into the superstructure, I began finding things that shouldn't have been there. Personal items scattered throughout areas that should have been picked clean by decades of ocean currents. A watch still ticking on a skeletal wrist. Photographs in waterproof cases showing families that had been waiting for their men to come home. Letters from wives and girlfriends, the ink still legible despite 8 decades underwater. But it was the bodies that really got my attention. I found the first one wedged behind a control panel in the radio room. Still wearing his Navy uniform, still sitting at his post like he died trying to send a distress signal. But the body was wrong. After 80 years underwater, there should have been nothing left but bones and scraps of clothing. Instead, I was looking at a perfectly preserved corpse, skin pale and waterlogged, but intact. Eyes still in their sockets, staring at nothing. The man looked like he drowned yesterday rather than in 1943. I found 6 more bodies as I explored the upper decks, all in the same impossible state of preservation, all positioned as if they died in the middle of their duties and never moved since. That's when I realized I wasn't alone on the wreck. I was photographing one of the bodies when I heard metallic banging echoing through the ship's hull. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic, like someone tapping out a message in Morse code. The sound was coming from deep inside the ship, somewhere in the lower decks where the worst of the flooding had occurred. I followed it down through a maze of twisted corridors and collapsed compartments, using my diving light to navigate the wreck's dark interior. The banging grew louder as I descended, accompanied by other sounds that made my skin crawl. Voices murmuring just below the threshold of understanding. Footsteps echoing through flooded hallways. The groaning of metal under stress, as if the ship was still settling into its rocky grave. I found the source of the banging in what had been the engine room. A man in navy dungarees was standing waist deep in black water, rhythmically striking a wrench against a piece of machinery. He was perfectly preserved like the others, but unlike the others, he was moving. He turned to look at me as I approached, and I saw that his eyes were solid black. No pupils, no whites, just darkness that seemed to absorb my diving light. His mouth opened and closed like he was trying to speak, but only water came out. That is when I understood what I was really looking at. These weren't T-bodies. They were something else entirely. Something that had been created when 37 men died in terror and desperation. Their last moments preserved by forces I didn't want to understand. I tried to back away, but the narrow corridor behind me was suddenly full of them. More preserved crew members, all moving with the slow, purposeful gait of people walking underwater. They surrounded me without making a sound, their black eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. I expected them to attack, to drag me down into the flooded depths of their ship. Instead, they just watched me, waiting, like they wanted something but couldn't to communicate what it was. That is when I heard the voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the flooded compartments with the weight of absolute authority. A ship's captain giving orders to his crew, even in death. The voice told me things I didn't want to know. About the night the Coldbrook died, about how the crew had been trapped below deck as freezing water poured through the hull breaches, about their final hours, huddled together in air pockets that grew smaller and smaller as hypothermia and panic consumed them. But it also told me about what happened after they died, how their collective terror and desperation had created something new, something that existed in the space between life and death. The crew of the Coldbrook hadn't moved on to whatever comes next. They were still here, still trying to complete their final mission. They wanted me to help them. The voice explained that the cargo they'd been carrying wasn't just supplies for the war effort. Hidden deep in the ship, this hold was something else, something that had been classified so highly that even the captain hadn't known what it was. Something that needed to be delivered to its destination before the crew could find peace. I wanted to refuse, to swim away from that nightmare and never look back. But I was surrounded by 37 men who had been waiting 80 years for someone to complete their mission. Men who had died in service to their country and been forgotten by everyone except the cold Alaska Sea. I followed them deeper into the wreck. The ship's hold was a maze of twisted metal and scattered cargo. Decades of storms had shifted everything around, creating a three-dimensional puzzle of debris and darkness. But the crew knew exactly where they were going. They led me through the chaos to a sealed compartment that had somehow remained watertight. Inside was a single metal container, unmarked except for a series of numbers that meant nothing to me. It was small enough to carry maybe 50 pounds, but when I touched it, I felt a vibration that seemed to come from inside the metal itself. The preserved crew watched as I secured the container to my diving gear. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they began to fade. Not disappearing exactly, but becoming translucent, like images projected on smoke. The captain's voice spoke one final time, giving me coordinates and instructions that burned themselves into my memory. The container had to be delivered to a specific location on the Alaska mainland. Only then would their mission be complete. I swam out of that wreck as fast as my equipment would allow, but I could feel them watching me go. 37 pairs of black eyes following my ascent until I broke the surface and gasped in the cold October air. I radioed Stevens immediately, requesting emergency extraction. He arrived within hours, asking no questions about why I was cutting my salvage operation short. But I could see the relief in his face when he realized I was leaving the island. The flight back to Kodiak gave me time to think about what I experienced. Logic told me it had been some kind of diving-related hallucination, maybe nitrogen narcosis or decompression sickness affecting my perception. But the metal container strapped to my gear argued otherwise. When we landed, I researched the coordinates the captain's voice had given me. They pointed to a remote military facility that had been decommissioned since the end of World War II. The kind of place where classified research had been conducted far from prying eyes. I could have turned the container over to authorities, let them figure out what to do with 80-year-old military secrets. But something told me that wouldn't satisfy the crew of the Coldbrook. They'd been specific about where their cargo needed to go. The drive to the facility took 2 days across some of the most desolate country in Alaska. When I arrived, I found nothing but empty buildings and rusted equipment, all surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. But there was something else there, something that had been waiting. An old man, maybe 90 years old, standing by the main gate like he'd been expecting me. He introduced himself as Dr. Morrison, one of the last surviving members of the research team that had worked at the facility during the war. He knew about the Coldbrook. More than that, he'd been waiting for someone to recover the container I carried. Waiting for 80 years. Morrison explained that the research at the facility had involved attempts to weaponize human consciousness, to create soldiers who could continue fighting even after death. The container held the results of their experiments, data that had been too dangerous to transmit by radio or regular mail. The Cold Brook had been sunk deliberately, he told me, not by enemy action or bad weather, but by people who realized the research had gone too far. The ship's crew had died to keep the container from reaching its destination, sacrificing themselves to prevent something terrible from being unleashed. But their sacrifice had created its own horror. Their collective will to complete their mission had bound them to the wreck, trapping them in a state between life and death. They couldn't move on until their duty was fulfilled, even if fulfilling it meant delivering the very thing they died to stop. Morrison took the container with hands that shook with age and anticipation. He explained that the research it contained could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness and death, could create armies of soldiers who would never truly die. I left him there in that abandoned facility and drove back to civilization, telling myself I'd done the right thing. The crew of the Cold Brook could finally rest. Their mission was complete, but I've been having dreams ever since. Dreams of 37 men standing in formation on the deck of a rusted ship, saluting as something dark and terrible spreads across the world like a plague. I think I've made a mistake. I think the crew of the Cold Brook wasn't trying to complete their mission. They were trying to warn me about it, and now it's too late to take it back. Dr. Morrison has been calling me every day for 3 months, excited about his progress with the container, its contents. He talks about breakthrough discoveries and practical applications, about a world where death is just another obstacle to overcome. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that captain, his voice echoing in my head. Not giving orders this time, but screaming warnings about what I've helped unleash. The dead dawn. To stay quiet. And soon, they won. To stay dead other.